John O'Sullivan is a man of many gifts being used in many locations around the world. He is president of the Danube Institute based in Budapest. The Danube Institute is an independent center of intellectual debate for conservatives and classical liberals and their democratic opponents in Central Europe. He is also editor of Quadrant Magazine, an Australian-based periodical, a senior editor-at-large and columnist at National Review magazine, where he served as editor from 1988 to 1997, senior fellow at the National Review Institute, and co-founder of Washington, D.C.'s think tank 21st Century Initiatives. Previously, he served as Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty's executive editor. He has served as a senior editor at the London Times and the Daily Telegraph, and in the British government as a special advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Mr. O'Sullivan has also been editor-in-chief of United Press International. His book, The President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister, has been translated into 7 languages, and he was made a commander of the British Empire in 1991. Please welcome John O'Sullivan.
Risk putting that there for the moment. Madam Chairman, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, old friends, may I begin by thanking you, Madam Chairman, for that very generous and overfull introduction. The older I get, the more astonished I am to listen to that long list of my former jobs. Was I really an associate editor of the London Times? How come I did nothing about his outrageous anti-conservative bias? It reminds me of my mother's reaction when she heard an equally generous introduction a few years ago. Yes, she said, John just can't seem to hold down a job. Well, it's a particular pleasure to speak to a Hillsdale College audience. My first visit to Hillsdale was in 1976 when the college played host to a meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society. That was attended, by coincidence, by a large delegation of people who had come directly from that year's Republican convention. Needless to say, they were all disappointed Reagan delegates, but though disappointed, they were not despairing. One of them said to me that after hearing Reagan's great address to the conventions last night, when he stole the show from the nominee, President Ford, he knew, the man said, he knew that something important, not something historical, but something almost anticipating history, had just happened that night. He said to me, we lost the election. We lost the nomination, and we're probably going to lose the election. But since that night, I've known that Reagan is going to be president. How he's going to be president, I just can't see. It looks impossible, but I know that he is going to be president, and of that I'm absolutely convinced. Well, a few months later, after the election had been lost, Pete Hannaford, who I think would be a friend to many people here, rang up Mike Deaver in California and told him that Citizen Reagan had been told by a hotel manager that some hotel staff would like to meet him before he left that day. Reagan graciously agreed, he always did really, expecting to meet a few conservative stalwarts. But when he went downstairs, he found the entire hotel staff had lined up to shake his hand as if he were a monarch on a state visit. Hannaford said to Deaver, and this is not an exact quote, I'm afraid, Mike, something has happened to how people feel about the governor. It's not just Hollywood and not just his governorship. Somehow they see him as a president. Now, I have no doubt that that change of sentiment among ordinary people towards Reagan, not one echoed by the elites or the media, was in part the result of his convention speech that year. At a low point of his fortunes, he demonstrated his own visionary greatness and his own patriotic faith in the American people at a time when all of America was watching on television. They saw then what Pope John Paul II later called Reagan's noble soul, and their view of him changed. That's a lesson to all of us, not simply for apprentice statesmen. Whatever the next few months holds politically, we all have a duty to represent the conservative best in the American dream and not its occasional descents into nightmare. The whole world may not be watching us, but those around us will be, and they will remember what we do. Recall the words that Margaret Thatcher used about the president at his funeral. She said, "We have one advantage Ronald Reagan never had. We have his example." And today, as other days, are the times to follow it. Now, my second visit to Hillsdale was for another Mont Pelerin meeting at which Hayek and Friedman both spoke. I'm pretty sure their topic was the free market, and I'm pretty sure they were in favor of it. And, Madam Chairman, by Jove, so am I. Not millions, but billions of people who were starving 30 years ago are now living middle-class lives around the world because of the free market revolution brought about by Hayek and Friedman, Reagan and Thatcher. Those billions are buying American goods and services. Some working people and some businesses in America and Britain have lost ground and suffered some displacement, some unemployment as a result of the side effects of this revolution. And I think more will do so as a result of the coming automation revolution too. We have to devise ways of enabling them to adjust and benefit from this economic progress that lightens labor and rewards effort and ingenuity. Conservatives are for all Americans, not simply the coupon-clipping classes and corporate managers. But we don't want to close down the engine of prosperity simply because it doesn't reward everyone equally. Milton, I'd say three things. We don't confuse that was the first. The second is we don't confuse free markets with open borders. Milton Friedman didn't. He thought you couldn't have open immigration into a welfare state like ours or Europe's, and we shouldn't either. We undoubtedly need new economic thinking to deal with new economic challenges, but we don't need anti-economic thinking. I think I also might add to that a third or fourth proposal. We shouldn't confuse free trade with managed trade agreements, particularly those which try to avoid democratic control. So I am for free trade, I am for control of immigration, and I am for a sensible, I am for government that tries to help people to help themselves to deal with crises in their lives that have been created by developments that are on the whole beneficial. Now, my third visit was to speak to Hillsdale, was to speak at the unveiling of the Margaret Thatcher statue that the campus now has. It was a little unnerving to speak with herself looking over my shoulder. But I fortified myself with one of her, I should say I fortified myself with a glass of her favorite scotch. But in fact, it was I fortified myself with one of her favorite reflections. One, oddly enough, that she shared with Maynard Keynes. She called this Thatcher's law. The unexpected always happens. The inevitable, never. And ladies and gentlemen, the election campaign has demonstrated the truth of that again and again. I also recall, by the way, that another speaker at that unveiling was a friend also of many here today, namely Pat Sajak, the much-loved and much-respected television host, who had decided to come back to college to get a further degree. I think that's admirable, and so would Margaret Thatcher. Maybe Americans don't know this, but Lady Thatcher was an early supporter and later the Chancellor of the Independent University of Buckingham, which is the nearest equivalent to Hillsdale in the United Kingdom. It requires, I know this, it requires enormous dedication and commitment to preserve a college with the highest standards when it has to compete with the taxpayer-supported unlimited funds of the state system or the vast bequests of the Ivy League. That dedication, that commitment, they are doubly necessary when we see the extremes of corruption, cowardice, and anarchy into which the state system and the Ivy League colleges have descended in the last few years, this year particularly. On a personal note here, I think I may be the first visitor to Yale, this happened 20 years ago, to be attacked by a howling mob of PhD students. It happened when I spoke on multiculturalism, and I had to be rescued by the police. But nothing terrible happened, except, of course, it was terrible that students, particularly advanced students, should feel that they had to suppress points of view which were, well, sufficiently respectable to be the lead article in that week's magazine. So we are deeply in the debt of those like President Arne and the Buckingham trustees, who not only sustain a great liberal university, but actually run serious academic outreach programs to give citizen voters a better understanding of their nation's history and traditions. So I hope that other colleges will follow your example, and I hope many others will follow Mr. Sajak's example. I will confess, by the way, that day when Mr. Sajak spoke, I was hoping he'd enrolled at Hillsdale because he had ambitions outside Hollywood and was doing prep, so to speak. Oh yes, Hollywood conservatives are always complaining how tough life is for them and how they face political prejudice from liberals, but I take that with a pinch of salt. Statistics show that 1 in 3 Hollywood conservatives, 1 in 3, goes on to become President of the United States. Now, the title of my talk is How People Around the World See the November Election, or something like that. I didn't actually choose the title. Usually I followed the example of Ronald Reagan's first great national address in 1965 and call all my talks Rendezvous with Destiny. It suits every occasion, every topic. You can call it Brexit, Rendezvous with Destiny for Britain, or Rendezvous with Destiny, the Globalization Imperative, by Robert Ludlum. It adds tone to a speech, it has a touch of class, even if it gets less plausible with every passing year that destiny has arranged a rendezvous with me, unless it's the name of a young woman on an erotically themed website. But on this occasion, the title might seem to be apposite. Mr. Chairman, looking at the November election and the turmoil it has produced, particularly the turmoil it's produced within the conservative movement, I wonder if this will be the very first talk on conservatism I've ever given that leads to a barroom brawl in the audience. Until very recently, the idea of a fistfight between the editors of National Review and the Claremont Journal would have been more or less inconceivable. The fistfight between the editors of Chronicles and Commentary, no, we can imagine that. But things have come to a pretty pass when half of the conservative movement is on what we might call no speakers terms with the other half, because one of them might vote Republican. Today, senior conservatives are cutting each other in battalions in the public square, as beyond the city walls, the drummings and ululations of the alt-right fall ominously on the night air. Reagan's 11th commandment, thou shalt speak no ill of another Republican, has been thrown overboard. It should all make for a terrific debate, but not really a very effective election campaign. Consider first not the significant political issues that emerged in the primaries, in the Trump and Sanders campaigns particularly, but the overall feel of the race today. The serious issues that emerge in the primaries, nationalism, economic protection, political correctness, a new, less interventionist foreign policy, whatever you think of them, they have been overshadowed, if not obliterated, by the antics, the gaffes, and the plausibly alleged crimes of both campaigns. Maybe the best metaphor for the race to date is one that Donald Trump himself has used, the fixed fight. On this occasion, however, it looks as though the mob has blundered and bribed both candidates to take a fall. So they stagger around the ring, hurling loud blows at each other, but leaving their defenses wide open, suffering, therefore, blows of equal noise, and they eventually fall back exhausted into the arms of their staff trainers. Each seems to be fighting and to lose in his or her distinctive way. Mrs. Clinton is being undermined by the continuing drip, drip, drip of her own emails that show her to have lied and broken federal laws during and since her time as Secretary of State. Trump is being derailed at intervals by his own gaffes and insults, such as most recently his alleged not most recently, but just recently, his alleged fat-shaming of a homicidal gangster's mole whom he once employed comparatively respectably as a beauty queen. Fat-shaming being worse crime today than gangsterism and attempted murder in the eyes of feminism in the media, the Clinton campaign has taken good advantage of this and began promoting the beauty queen. And to be fair, one can see why the beauty queen's excusatory motto, "We all have a past," would appeal to the Clintons. But as this week has also shown, to Donald Trump too. Both candidates are now embroiled in an ugly, dirty, and vulgar disputes that unfortunately have no way of being settled. The charges of sexual battery against Trump and Hillary's covering up Bill Clinton's sexual assaults are both plausible and also unprovable beyond doubt. That means they just drag on indefinitely. So both presidential candidates are now two of the most distrusted people in America. Each overtakes the other at intervals, depending on whether her lies or his gaffes dominate the headlines. Clinton has the current advantage because Trump's alleged groping has captured recent headlines, and because the media, biased beyond even the generous standards of an official communist media in the Eastern Europe, because the media has played down the recent WikiLeaks exposure of her campaign's mixture of cynicism and religious prejudice. But one has to say that may well change in the, not the bias, but the issues, may well change in the light of later events. There are 4 full weeks of hyperactive campaigning and a final presidential debate between now and Election Day. So, as my title asks, how does all that strike the rest of the world? Well, the short answer, of course, has to be that it strikes the rest of the world as exciting and entertaining, but neither serious nor hopeful, as a sort of, well, it strikes it a bit like a soapbox version of Yes, Prime Minister, that's comparatively sober, but the West Wing or, what's the British show that became an American show? It's slipped my mind now. Yes, House of Cards. Yeah, I mean that even has a murder in, as I remember, and we may be going in that direction. But the thing is that, the American elections always. By the way, when I worked for Radio Free Europe, all of the East Europeans and the Soviet people ex-Soviet people who worked there, they all were fascinated by American elections because they are genuine elections. You don't know what's going to happen. A lot of their countries, you know exactly what's going to happen, down to a percentage decimal point. But the fact is, this is a real democracy, which is what makes its elections so interesting. But they also strike people. They also make foreign observers say things like, "This is America, anything can happen here." It's a kind of tabloid country. Much more troublingly, when the foreign media tries to go beneath this surface and convey the serious matters at stake, they tend to repeat the liberal interpretations of what Paul Johnson calls the 7 deadly sinners: the Times, the Post, Time, Newsweek, and NBC, CBS, and ABC. In America, the monopoly of interpretation that these news media used to enjoy has been significantly undermined by talk radio, Fox News, the social media, and other insurgencies. But the Washington press corps is still unduly influenced the foreign press corps is still unduly influenced by the legacy media. And Peter Bauer's old maxim, Peter Bauer's old maxim, what matters in today's world is not the sound, but the echo, is something that's still very important in transatlantic transmissions. So, when Sir Max Hastings was asked by The Spectator what he made of the election campaign, he replied that if Trump wins, it will be a mass retreat from reason. Sir Max himself is a moderate conservative, and he quoted other moderate and intelligent people, such as the historian Michael Howard, another Sir, as expressing the same or similar views. a Google search would multiply those names right across the political spectrum. I will sum up their collective wisdom here as arguing that the election itself is a carnival of irrationalism, that Hillary Clinton is a bad candidate and a dishonest politician, but a more or less safe and orthodox prudential president, that Trump is a reckless and unpredictable demagogue, that his supporters are ill-informed and prejudiced voters who have fallen victim to a dangerous populism. In short, the American electorate is irrational, ill-informed, and populist, and the more thoughtful foreign observers concede that the same evils can be seen in Europe, in Brexit, in Poland, in Hungary, and in the rise of populist parties throughout their own continent. Ironically, of course, it is the foreign observers who are inevitably ill-informed. They are drawing on a narrow range of sources for their opinions, mainly the newspapers I mentioned, and those sources do not include their own experience. Ordinary voters root their views in that experience, among other things. I would say the weakness of Mrs. Clinton's campaign, among others, is that she has closed her ears to the experience of many voters, especially white former Democrats, on a range of issues like Black Lives Matter and anti-cop violence. And she's done so in the interests of arousing her base among minorities by making the maximum possible demands. Donald Trump, on his side, seems to me not always to understand the issues such as immigration control and protection, which he has exploited, and which the voters are definitely worried about because of their experience. My feeling here is, others may differ, is that Trump blundered into these anxieties while campaigning and found himself gaining support more than he expected as a result of responding to them. Eventually, he adopted policies to deal with them and found himself winning the primaries. But he changes his positions now and then, and it's reasonable to think that he hasn't fully worked out a plausible set of policies to deal with the matters he's discussing. In other words, if you look at what the foreign observers say, they're putting the blame not first and foremost on the candidates, whom they think are responding to popular concerns, but on the voters. So are the voters to blame? Did they push the candidates into extreme positions? Are they irrational, populist, racist? David Blankenhorn, the president of the Institute of American Values, found he didn't know a single person who favored Donald Trump. So he decided, well, I ought to know. I'm the president of the Institute of American Values. I ought to find out what are the values of masses of Americans, in particular the people who support Trump. He spent 2 weeks driving around America's southeast, my home incidentally, I live in northern Alabama, and talking to whoever would talk to him. The results, an article that quotes extensively from ordinary Americans talking about Trump and Clinton, are to be found in the current issue of the American Interest, and they are well worth reading and pondering. Among other things, he found that Trump voters, far from being irrational, were very realistic, occasionally even cynical, about Trump. Those who supported him most strongly did so because they liked the fact that he wasn't bound by political correctness when he spoke about immigration and other issues. He spoke about them as he saw them, they said. Paradoxically, some of the same people, those supporting him, disliked his insults to other people. They disliked his use of profane language. They disliked his inability to control his own mouth. They thought these were faults, and the faults were needless and damaging. But they liked what one might call his political profanities all the same. Many of them were skeptical that Trump would do what he promised, or succeed even if he tried. But they thought that he was much more likely than any other candidate to try these things and to succeed if he did. On the whole, they had a low opinion of all politicians and little deep hope of electing a good government. It was merely that Trump offered something better than the establishment polls. As one supporter said, "What's the worst thing that can happen? He doesn't do what he says he's going to do? I've seen that for the last 30 years. In fact, that's not the worst thing that can happen, alas, but it's still an eloquent comment on the last 30 years. Were their comments racist? Well, I don't think so, but you can read Blankenhol's article and judge for yourself. One had mild criticisms of black Americans working in the health field, but he was a dying man, as he said, and perhaps somewhat more critical and difficult than usual. Another was critical of Muslim immigration and its effects. But in the main, the distinctions these voters made between Americans were rooted in politics and in social position far more than race or religion. These people are fearful about the future, and they have an acute sense of loss. They feel that the America they have known and loved is being taken away from them and replaced by something worse. They might not use the term, but they are losing, they think, they are losing Tocquevillian America with its habits of trust and social cooperation. Most of them, incidentally, were not badly off. They weren't on drugs, they weren't alcoholics, and they weren't unemployed. Some were, of course. In short, they were not members of an underclass, left behind by history and economic progress, but ordinary working or retired Americans who lived at one level or another in the great American middle class. If they are dispossessed of anything, they are culturally dispossessed. Are they then populists or attracted by populism? Not if the usual meaning of populism, namely that there is a deep vein of wisdom in the common people, not if that definition has any force. Almost all of them were coldly realistic in their assessments of people, including Trump, and about their own hopes for the future. What they asserted, and what many people mistake for populism, is that there is a deep vein, they thought there was a deep vein of arrogance and stupidity in the elites. Trump's people don't glorify themselves, but they are contemptuous of the elites that have governed America for the last few decades. They especially distrusted Hillary Clinton. Blankenhorn could not find a single person who liked or trusted her. At the same time, they didn't see her as someone very different from those governing them now. She was simply the most representative person of the kind of elitist progressive politician that they have come to dislike and fear. So let me put it this way, both in terms of policy and philosophy on the one hand, and in terms of personnel on the other, there is a major issue before the people at this election that may be concealed at the moment by the sleaze factor. Trump voters and the US electorate more broadly are neither irrational, nor racist, nor populist, but they are overwhelmingly hostile to the kind of interventionist, controlling, liberal, progressive, internationalist government that, in their view, has governed them badly for a long time and which refuses to listen to their complaints. They are also, they are also, well, they have the same attitude to the national and international elites that they see as the supporters and enablers of that kind of government. They see the divide in US politics as one between, well, I could give it several definitions. Globalists versus nationalists, elites versus the voters, democracy versus oligarchy. They see their own elites as joined to elites internationally, the whole Leviathan metastasizing at home and abroad. And when foreign observers have gotten over their enjoyment at mocking American elections, they too recognized exactly the same divide in their own politics, in Brexit, in Central Europe's resistance to Brussels, in the growing popular opposition in Germany to the acceptance of millions of Middle East migrants, and in the anxieties everywhere about massive social change organized by governments and global bodies that don't bother to consult citizens and voters about it, or if they do, don't do anything when they get the results. This divide is recognized increasingly by political writers, and events such as Brexit and the rise of Donald Trump have forced it on people's attention. It has elicited from conservative writers in particular a series of sometimes surprised, sometimes profound, usually shrewd, and almost revolutionary reflections on the nature of this division and its consequences across the board. Those writers include the Polish statesman-philosopher Richard Legutko in his book The Demon in Democracy, Walter Russell Mead on the American Interest blog, Israeli editor Yoram Hazony in Mosaic, my NR National Review colleagues, Ramesh Ponnuru and Yuval Levin, who point out in depth and in detail the constitutional threat that Hillary Clinton poses to America's traditional constitution, John Fonte of the Hudson Institute in his critiques of global governments, and his book Submission or Sovereignty, and that fellow with the Russian name in the Claremont Review, I can't remember, Cato, Seneca, I hope not Petronius, because I was reserving Petronius for my internet rendezvous with destiny. Doubtless I have missed other important analyses in my Australian exile, though someone else who has contributed mightily to the critique of legal transnationalism is Professor James Allen of Queensland University. To my mind, however, forgive my pronunciation, Yoram Halzany has given us the most comprehensive account of the clash between two visions of national and global order. Let me quote it. "What we are seeing is the beginning of a struggle over the character of the international political order itself. For 350 years, Western peoples have lived in a world in which national independence and self-determination were seen as foundational principles." See, among other places, by the way, the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, I'm continuing with Halzany, these things were held to be among the most precious human possessions and the basis of all their freedoms. Since World War II, however, these intuitions have been gradually attenuated and finally even discredited, especially among academics and intellectuals, media opinion makers, and the business and political elite, and I would say particularly so in Germany. Today, many in the West have come to regard an intense personal loyalty to the national state and its right to chart an independent course in the world as something not only unnecessary, but morally suspect. They no longer see national loyalties and traditions as necessarily providing a sound basis for determining the laws we live by, for regulating the economy, or making decisions about defense and security, for establishing public norms, or for deciding who gets to live in what part of the world. That's the end of the Halzany quote. Now, tonight is not the occasion for a full taxonomy of the many different ways in which this clash plays out across the range of economic, political, foreign, and constitutional policy. For that, read the writers I mentioned. But one aspect deserves to be singled out, that of democracy, which flourishes only in the nation state and which cannot really survive in post-national organizations which do not have a link, they are not accountable to voters anywhere, and have to confess again and again to a democratic deficit. A democratic deficit which, even when acknowledged by them, somehow never gets filled in. It was borne in on me during the Brexit campaign that the Leave campaign wanted above all to recover Britain's status as a self-governing democracy, while the Remain campaign wanted to avoid discussion of that point at all costs. That has continued in the post-Brexit aftermath, in which recidivist Remainers have sought to blame Brexit on popular ignorance, populism, racism, and anything but what the Leavers said plainly was their main ambition. One American critic, former US Ambassador to Germany, John Kornblum, illustrates this point. Writing in the same issue of the American Interest as David Blankenhorn, he says, "Look at the key calculation that affected the Brexit vote. It was about how much dole the European provides to depressed Rust Belt areas of Scotland, Wales, and England as against what Britain pays into the common pot. The whole idea is that the future of the United Kingdom should be decided on the basis of such objective economic weakness and calculative pandering beggars belief," unquote. Well, what truly beggars belief is that anyone should believe such nonsense. I do not deny that economic arguments were used on both sides of the campaign, but the economic arguments in that campaign were overwhelmingly from the Remain camp. They invariably predicted economic disaster if it went through. But those arguments were rejected by the voters. Indeed, they were rejected by the very voters who, according to Ambassador Kornblum, would have been most hit if the predictions had proved accurate. It was the Rust Belt areas of economic depression in Britain that voted most heavily, between 60 and 70%, for Leave. Maybe they disbelieved the predictions, and if so, they were pretty right on the evidence so far. But the evidence is stronger that they were voting to recover and safeguard their political rights and liberties. How can we explain the inability of a distinguished diplomat to see what's in front of his nose? One reason, I think, is that globalists judge the value of political decisions of a political decision less by its results than by its provenance. If it's taken by a global body, it's assumed to represent virtue and efficiency. If it's taken by a national government, it's thought to represent selfishness and anarchy. Globalism gets the benefit of every doubt because it allegedly represents the future, although the idea that elites know what the future holds should have taken a complete knock in 1989. Now, one shouldn't be dogmatic. Decisions taken by national governments are sometimes wrong, see Smoot-Hawley, and my own view is that simple protectionism is usually counterproductive. But few national decisions have had such calamitous consequences as the collective EU decision to launch and sustain the euro. If that persists today, it is because it's not really subject to the democratic verdict of any particular European nation. It is upheld by a post-national euro establishment that has only a remote connections with accountability and the voters. In a world of post-democratic globalism, major decisions will increasingly be made in that way and increasingly sustained, whatever their apparent results. Who will decide such questions in the United States? Washington or some kind of global coalition is the underlying issue in this election. Mrs. Clinton, whatever her faults and virtues, is plainly a determined globalist, as President Obama has been. Donald Trump is plainly an opponent. Now, I think it's a historical tragedy that this decision has been overwritten by the question of both candidates' fitness for the presidency. It seems evident to me, others will differ, that neither is the best representative of their cause, but there is no good reason to prefer Mrs. Clinton to Donald Trump on the basis of their personal and moral fitness. I could put it no higher than that. But I would say that one of the things that Donald Trump has demonstrated is a willingness to take on the Clintons in a straightforward, tough way, which very few other politicians, afraid of their power, have been prepared to do. It may well be it is only a politician of the kind who has some of the faults of Trump who would be prepared to do this. Let me put it this way. It may be the kind of campaign that only a kamikaze campaign can actually dent some of the self-sufficiency and self-satisfaction of the Clintons and of the kind of politics they represent. As Hassany points out, well, actually, the questions are coming, so you can throw the point at me. Well, I can't hear you, but I'm sure that's an interesting point. But I mean, I'm going to take questions. As Hassany points out, no matter what happens in November, the political fault line has been uncovered at the heart of Western politics, and it's not going away. The politics of the democratic nations are rearranging themselves along this fault line. New candidates for office, perhaps more appealing than Trump, perhaps less so, will take up one or another version of the same cause with consequences we cannot now predict. If conservatives finally need advice on what to do here, they can find it, and I never expected to hear myself say this, in an article in the American Political Science Review. It dates from 1956. It was written by the late Sam Huntington, and its title was Conservatism as an Ideology. Conservatism, Huntington held, was that system of ideas employed to defend established institutions when they came under fundamental attack. When the foundations of society are threatened, the conservative ideology reminds men of the necessity of some institutions and the desirability of the existing ones. And when something like the French Revolution comes along, says Huntington, men are driven to conservatism by the shock of events, by the horrible feeling that a society or an institution they have approved of or taken for granted may suddenly cease to exist. What is happening today that most resembles the challenge, say, of the French Revolution? Any answer must be to some degree speculative, but my own is that the next great challenge can now be seen in the gradual undermining of democracy and the shift of power and decision-making from institutions accountable to the voters to those that are either accountable to no one but themselves, or that inhabit a constitutional limbo where they cannot easily be held to account. We see the harbingers of this challenge across the first world in three developments: the shift of power from legislatures to bureaucratic agencies and the courts brought about by overgovernment, the shift of power from nation states to supranational bodies, and finally the development of anti-democratic ideas that, lagging behind events, serve to justify these relatively new political practices and to defend the new loci of undemocratic power. That is now the battle today. I happen to have written those words in 1998. But this is the first time since then that we have been given a clear chance to vote against this threat to our institutions, our democratic institutions in our two countries. Whatever our doubts, however reasonable our doubts, I don't believe we should pass up the opportunity to vote for the candidate who is determined to stop this. Thank you. Are there any questions? Let me change my glasses. Well, that's no better. Thank you. Any questions? Oh, that's very satisfying. Answered all questions in advance, really. Oh, there's one. Sorry, it's a question here.
Hello, I'm Maurice Norwood. I'm from Dallas, Texas. And when you started off your speech, you talked about free trade agreements, et cetera. Having been a person who have read CAFTA, NAFTA, and numerous other smaller trade agreements, and then now at least portions of TPP, which I don't have to read the rest of it to understand what it's about. None of it is about free trade. None of it is about fair trade. There's only about 5% about trade, none of which is to the benefit of the American people. Second of all, you brought, and this is once again early on, and I could have it going with 100 questions, but you talked about Ronald Reagan, and certainly he's a better president than a bunch that we've had around, but let's never forget that Ronald Reagan was the first person to give amnesty to illegals. And then we had a whole number of smaller amnesties, and now we're continuing on a nation without borders, and we continue down this whole line of the progressive movement that started long ago, and that everybody wants to think it just happened today.
Yes.
It doesn't. Please comment, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to. By the way, I think I'm going to comment more on your remarks on immigration than on the kind of trade agreements we have, like NAFTA. I think that, frankly, they are so specialized that I would prefer to have somebody take the general principles that we believe in. One of which would be, for example, that trade agreements, treaties can't override state and federal government. But on immigration, yes, was Reagan responsible for the 1986 Immigration Control Act? He certainly bore some responsibility for it. So did the Senate and the House and so on. He himself, read his diaries, that this is almost made nothing of. But the senator on the Republican side who was most active in putting that bill through, I'm trying to think of his name, he was from Colorado. No, it wasn't Bill Armstrong. Sorry? No, he was a Republican. Anyway, the point is he was a conservative Republican, he was an intelligent man and a good man, and he pushed through this as part of a deal which would have been, okay, we're now imposing, Simpson, that's right. We're now imposing controls more effectively, we'll stop future immigration, and the cost of that is to give acceptance to the people who are here. Reagan has a meeting with him around that time and says, in the diaries you can see it, he said, I saw Senator Simpson here, we had a drink. He's absolutely right. We've got to stop this unlimited immigration. His bill gave us an opportunity to do this decently, and so on and so forth. There is no doubt that Reagan wanted to control and regulate and reduce immigration. There's equally no doubt that in retrospect, that failed completely. It failed partly because people did not understand that if you've got, that first of all, more people would be so to speak, legalized than people thought in advance. I mean, the numbers who applied turned out to be larger. And secondly, that there would be, with the direction of policy and sympathies in the Democratic Party, there would be no support for enforcing the restraints that judges would. I mean, immigration control is laughable in this country, as a matter of fact. I mean, unless you're an immigrant as I am, who's gone played by the rules, and I mean, then you have to do what you're told. You know, you all probably know the work of Mark Stein. Well, Mark was employing someone who was an immigrant in his little organization, and he said, he got a call from the Immigration Control Office. And he was on the phone for about an hour, answering all their questions. And eventually he said, "Oh, you seem to be under some misapprehension. The young woman who works for me is not a legal immigrant," which she was really, not a legal, she's an illegal immigrant. And the guy said, oh, well, okay, thanks. No, we don't need to bother about that. And in a way, that seems to be official government policy. So your criticism of Reagan is in part fair, but it is based. But I think Reagan and anyone else of those opinions, given the knowledge that we have accumulated since then about the way immigration control is actually run, would not have signed that bill. And indeed, the immigration control in practice has got increasingly lax from the moment that the 65 bill was passed, let alone the 86 bill. And there has to be, I mean, obviously, this election is, among other things, an eruption of anger in the majority of the American people against this, and a wish to do something about it. And both in your country and in Britain, I think it's fair to say that the ordinary people are not hostile to immigrants. They are hostile to those who are criminals, of course, but they're not hostile to immigrants. They're hostile to the idea that they don't own this country and that anyone is entitled to come here who wishes to do so without benefit of law. And I think that feeling is a perfectly legitimate one. In fact, it's indistinguishable from a normal respect for democratic and national sovereignty. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
I'm getting off line. Oh, yes, there's a question here.
Thank you. Are you going to hold it? Okay. We often talk about the electorate being more fully informed, and I wonder if you have some suggestions about how the electorate can be better informed, because we have more information sources today than we ever had. Is it just a problem of they know so much that isn't true? You remember that famous quote from a former president? But how can we as a country better inform about the issues and where the candidates stand on those issues?
I don't think you're going to get people who have reasonably pleasant lives and who have so many distractions in terms of popular entertainment to want to become professors of political thought or anything like that. It's not going to happen. Now, the bare rudiments that we used to be able to get across, and we used to be able to get across a fair amount in public schools and in private schools, actually. I mean, my grandmother left school at 13, my mother left school at 14, my father at 14. They were very well-educated people. You know, and yet when I was last working in London, I had a secretary who was a graduate from Oxford, and she couldn't spell, she couldn't punctuate. You know, so what is happening when the major universities are receiving people who've got good marks in high schools who can't, who have to be given remedial education the first few months they're there because they don't know the basics? I mean, and I know that that's not true for everywhere, and I know that there are some very good schools, and we've recently had an improvement in education in England, and I think you have here, in your case with charter schools, and in our case with new forms of independent schools, which are created by the parents and subsidized by the government. These things are very important. These changes are important. We need to recover a good education for all of our children. And I don't know anybody who doesn't agree with that. Everyone thinks it's true. But it doesn't happen, does it? Now, there are many reasons why it doesn't happen, but one of them is that the politicians, particularly in the Democratic Party, are in hock to the teachers' unions. And the teachers' unions are, I'm not saying that they are actually hostile to children's education, though I have doubts about that, but but the teachers' unions are certainly don't make the education they give the principal thing. It's the protection of the teachers, which is their principal concern. And that often leads to schools keeping on bad teachers who they would very much like to fire and replace them with better teachers, but they're not allowed to do so under the deals that the teachers' unions have. And that the teachers' union monopsony is rooted in the public school monopoly. We need to find some ways, I think from an economic standpoint, of breaking up education monopolies as a way of getting a better service from education. I don't see, and it seems to me the simple, how do we get a better educated electorate? We make available a better education. You can see the appetite in the voters for education in the sale of books about the American history and the founding fathers, in the appetite for television programs of this kind. Ordinary people know very often that they should know more, and they try to get more, and they spend their own money to do it. But you can't expect kids who have never been given the grounding and which, fortunately, a college like Hillsdale gives. You can't expect children who have never been given a grounding in American constitutional history, in the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, in the importance of the Constitution, and in case of Britain, similar institutions. If they don't have the basics, they're not going to go further down the road of learning about what's going on and politics, and then they will be very much the potential victims of people who offer them much too simple and dangerous ideas, and most of those dangerous ideas, which damage politics and damage their young holders, come from the left. They don't come from the right. Yeah. Right.
Okay. I have two questions. Well, I'd like you to continue this comment. I see not immigration, illegal immigration are a real threat. It's two issues. One, illegal voter registration. Two, people coming from radicalized countries like Somalia, Middle Eastern countries that have the jihadist predominant theory that drives them. Please comment.
Well, it's obviously, it is obviously the case that anybody who comes into America should be able to demonstrate a respectable background and a willingness to abide by the American Constitution. I mean, that was something which traditionally America insisted on. If you go back and read books about America, like, for example, Chesterton's book on America after he'd been here, he came back and he said, of course America is a different kind of place to England. So he said, take Auberon Herbert, the anarchist writer. The police never go to, they don't think of arresting Mr. Herbert in order to prevent him throwing a bomb at the Queen. because they know that Mr. Herbert is a Tory squire, whatever his anarchist opinions, and he would never dream of doing anything against his sovereign. And they don't investigate the activities of Mr. Herbert Spencer, the libertarian writer, because they know that whatever his political opinions, Mr. Spencer is a nonconformist of the old school, and he would never dream of being violent towards anybody. But he says that's because they know Herbert Spencer, and they know Auberon Herbert. Now, the customs officer, the immigration officer in 1911, having millions of people streaming in, he doesn't know what these people are, so to speak, like. I mean, he doesn't know anything of them. So he has to ask them questions like, are you coming here with the intention of overthrowing the American Constitution? Of course, not likely to get an honest answer, but nonetheless, those kind of questions were asked. And for most of my life, I remember people being told that you couldn't, if you were a communist, you'd be asked if you were a communist, and if you were foolish enough to say yes, America wouldn't let you in. And that was, as I say, understandable in a nation of immigrants, in which lots and lots of people are coming in from about whom you have no idea what they are like. And therefore you have to, in a sense, investigate. Now that seems not to be done now in the way it clearly was done during the period of the Great Wave of immigration and in the 40s and 50s during the Cold War. It obviously has to be done in some way, but the more people are invited in or allowed in, the harder it is to do. And it's particularly hard to do if the authorities can't say, well, who do you know in Mogadishu who can vouch for you? And could I have his phone number? Because now, that's done, by the way, it's often done, but it's harder to do when you have very large numbers coming in and you have a breakdown of order in Mogadishu, because when you could ring up, American University in Beirut and say, look, I'm a bit worried about this fellow. Do you have any information from me? Does he seem the kind of chap we should have here? And you could do that, but you can't do that now. It's just, first of all, it may not even be legal, such are the rules these days, but also it's simply not practical in the way that it would have been once. So it's you obviously have to get control of immigration to the absolute minimum degree that you don't allow people in who intend to do you harm. It seems to me that's clear. I think you had other questions, but that's the most important one.